Right, let's kick off with JD, who has sent in a question by visiting newstatesman.com/you ask us. And this is a good one. He says, since the election, my new MP has been uncharacteristically silent. How have you found the mood of the new MPs? Is it ever the case that the job of an MP turns out to be not as one expects?
I'm surprised by this question, I have to say, because the MPs, there are huge numbers of new MPs blundering around the Houses of Parliament. And most of the ones I've been talking to are spending an awful lot of time in their constituencies. They might not be tweeting, they might not be on social media, but they're very much there because they are almost all of them terrified about the small size of their majorities. Now, it is a very, very discombobulating job. And there are some very, very successful, sophisticated people who've come in this Parliament who are still really struggling to get a handle on it. They find the arcane rules inside the chamber almost impossible to deal with. They are barraged by appeals to do this or support that group. APPG, that's the all-party parliamentary groups of one kind. We do this one, we do that one.
A bit like Freshers' Week, isn't it?
It's a bit like Freshers' Week. It's very, very like Freshers' Week, exactly so. Everybody's struggling. And, even those people, and I'm narrowing this down now a little bit, who have come straight in and become ministers are struggling with the business of actually being an MP. So I think lots of people are struggling. That's absolutely right. But the ones I talk to mostly go back to the constituency, if anything, too often, because they're so worried about the majorities.
Yeah, it's not clear from this question whether they mean that their MP has been quiet in the constituency or if they've been quiet online. Maybe they were big.
In the comments.
Or in the comments. Maybe they were big kind of social media figures beforehand, less so now. In answer to the question, is it ever the case that the job of MP turns out to be not as one expects? I've been speaking to MPs, range of parties, old, new, experience of government, experience of opposition, came in general elections, came in by-elections, and basically they all said that it wasn't what they expected, or that there were aspects that they didn't expect. And I think
there a theme?
I think a couple of things really stood out. One was just the chaos and the sense of being totally overwhelmed when you come in. Andrew's right, like it's exactly like new school or new university. You have got 1,000,001 briefings that you have to go to about, cybersecurity and etiquette. If you're not somebody who has had a career around Westminster before, there are people who've been researchers or SPADs before, but if you're not one of those, then the Commons etiquette can be really intimidating. A couple of people, particularly women, said to me that it really still feels like an old boys club, and it's very sort of public school dominated, and it feels like it's about who you know rather than what you know, and that can be really disorienting. People who came in by-elections get basically no support whatsoever. They're just thrown in at the start. Obviously, we had nearly 250 new Labour MPs, and they were treated as a new cohort, and they had briefings and they had trainings, but they didn't have offices for the first, couple of months. I mean, some of them still don't have permanent offices.
Why?
So there's because there's still
there aren't enough of
because
them,
there aren't
partly.
enough, and they're hot desking
and hot desking. That's quite right.
They said that if you said at the beginning that you were prepared to share an office with someone, like you had a buddy, you were more likely to get an office sooner. So if you could pair up with someone and be like,
forgive me being stupid, but the overall number of MPs has not changed. So why aren't there enough?
It hasn't. But there weren't enough offices before,
Right, okay.
and people made their own arrangements.
Right.
And Parliament's falling down.
And there's that. There's also where you live. For an awful lot of MPs struggling to find an affordable, rentable flat where they can get to and from Westminster after late night. So that's difficult. There was a very interesting moment in the week just past where there was a huge, as it were, Freshers' Fair in Portcullis House, where all the different parts of the parliamentary estate, the library, the security team, the catering, they all had sort of desks sat out there and, free toffees and free biscuits to encourage MPs. And MPs were coming along and basically being told all those basic things. If you want to have a bite of lunch, here are the 5 places you can go, and here is where they are. If you want to use the library, can you take out a book? Will they answer your questions if you're doing research? All of that stuff, that very, very basic stuff. Advice from the security people about panic alarms, all of that was being proffered in semi-public day by day, and lots of quite dazed-looking young MPs ambling up and down taking the advice. It was fascinating.
Yeah, it is. Important stuff, though.
Yeah.
Really, really important. And also, you sort of realise that it is a job that is completely different to any other, and there isn't sort of a fixed HR onboarding process. It's all very scattered and quite informal, obviously more formal for this cohort, but it's completely overwhelming. And then you've got the other question of what actually is the job and how does being an MP kind of differ from whatever it was that you were doing before. Another theme that came out with everyone I spoke to was just being terrified of the whips and being treated like potentially naughty school children by the whips, and being, I mean, there was varying degrees of this, but sort of quite, in some cases, quite surprised at the fact that you turn up as a new MP and you are just told how you're going to vote, what you're going to turn up for, and there's no question, there's no discussion. And I think if you're the kind of person who goes into politics because you have quite strong political beliefs and you want to change certain things, that can be a bit of a culture shock to get there and be told at the beginning, we don't care about you. You are one of hundreds of cogs in this very big party political machine. And then you've got a choice to make, which is, are you going to vote according to your principles and, career ladder, greasy pole be damned? Are you going to be an MP like, I don't know, Jeremy Corbyn before he unexpectedly became Labour leader, and you're going to be a rebel and you're going to be on your party's backbenches forever? Or are you going to try and work your way up, be a PPS, be a junior minister, in which case you're going to have to vote often quite a lot for things that you don't necessarily agree with, because that's the party line, and if you don't, that's your career gone. And it's a pretty binary decision that they're faced with kind of as soon as they turn up.
I mean, there is this paradox I find in our political system that Rachel's just articulated, because I do believe, I'm not a cynic, I do believe that the vast majority of our MPs go into politics because they want to change things for the better, whether one personally agrees with their political take. But in order to be in a position to actually affect change, you will have to vote against things that you personally disagree with in order to be promoted. It's tricky, isn't it?
Yeah, we shouldn't overemphasise this, though, because they've all been, elected on a manifesto. Yeah. And almost everything that they'll be voting from is connected to that manifesto directly. And I think what's different this time round is the nature of the election vote. So the Labour MPs, in that very, very large number, were actually elected on a relatively small proportion of the national vote. And very, very many of them have very narrow majorities. Before the election, the Labour Party, under Morgan McSweeney, was very, very disciplinary and tough about who they selected and who they didn't. So they're an abnormally loyal group at the moment, I would say. But they're an abnormally worried group about their constituencies. And that perhaps gives the whips an abnormal amount of power just at the moment. What I have not seen is the formation of, strong politically driven groups inside the PLP, the Parliamentary Labour Party, in a way that we had before. There isn't really a very vocal Tribune group. There certainly isn't a very vocal Socialist Campaign group. Those kind of factions that those of us who've covered politics for a long time were familiar with aren't kind of quite there. And so there is plenty of time, but it's very much the tension between number 10 and the PLP generally. And the PLP generally is being run in a slightly more disciplinary and aggressive way than I can ever remember.
Can we just compare that to maybe the new Conservative MPs, of which, of course, there were not that many. But interestingly, all of them, all 26, have been given a role in Kemi Badenoch's opposition. Yeah. So rather a different scenario for them.
Entirely different. Lots of them suddenly finding themselves at the dispatch box, throwing questions at genuine ministers for the first time. Some of them doing quite well at it, some of them less well.
I think also because there are just fewer Conservative MPs, if you want to be an effective opposition, you want your people asking awkward questions all the time. So if you're one of that cohort of the 26 new ones or the 121 Conservative MPs, you're going to be called on more often. You're going to be called on to speak in debates. You're going to be encouraged to...
More fun.
Yeah, more fun, but no actual power, I guess. But you are going to be encouraged to participate right from the beginning because they need people. They need bombs on seats, like challenging the government. Whereas if you're one of the new Labour MPs, you're just like one in the face of a crowd, and it might be quite a long time before you get to make any kind of intervention at all.
Our next questions come in via a comment on our YouTube channel from Jim, who asks, how long do you think this government will be able to do the necessary but unpopular things before it has to start worrying about re-election in 2029?
It started to worry about re-election in 2029 on day one, and yet it can carry on making unpopular decisions for some time, yet at least a couple of years. A lot of this, of course, focuses around the budget. And I'd just like to make one sort of point about the budget, which I think isn't enough made, which is this is an attempt to shift Britain's course. We were on one particular course of public spending and the public realm and taxation and all of that, and we are trying to be moved to a separate course. It's like changing the tracks on a railway almost. It's a big moment and a very, very difficult one. And if you think back to other similar big moments, it reminds me a little bit of the Geoffrey Howe budgets right at the beginning of the Thatcher period. Enormously popular. Remember the 365 economists demonstrating that Geoffrey Howe was a moron, and the huge weight of kind of elite media disdain and loathing for the government. Now, they did lots of things wrong. Nonetheless, looking back, you would say that was a really important moment when the national story slightly changed, well, not slightly, in a big way, changed direction. And it may be that we are at the same kind of moment now. In other words, this is the moment of maximum pain, the moment of maximum disillusion. It's a bit like being in a kind of economic, political purgatory, where we've been asked for the bill, we've paid the bill in the budget, as it were, but we've not seen the goods, we've not seen the stuff coming through yet. And so, although these are very, very dark days for the Labour Party, and I think Trump's election makes them much, much tougher still, I wouldn't give up hope yet. I think this is a moment where the country is changing direction. It's difficult, and that's what we're seeing.
But as we talked about yesterday, not only have they been given a pretty rotten inheritance, there are these other things that keep cropping up too. So we talked about the net migration figures, we've talked about assisted dying, but some of their own, some of the difficulties they're facing are of their own making as well. I mean,
they are. Well, the Chagos decision we should probably mention, where they made a kind of liberal, progressive decision to hand back the sovereignty of the Chagos Islands after a very, very long-running dispute. These are the islands in the Indian Ocean, which feature not very much except for an enormous USAF airbase, Diego Garcia, very important to the Americans. And we've done this deal with Mauritius, who are the nearest country to these islands. The islands' actual history has been everybody has owned the Chagos Islands at some point, as far as I can tell. But two things have happened since then. Although the deal guaranteed the American airbase for 99 years, it's very important for their relations with China, by the way, because it's one of the sort of key air bases as they look at China. Guaranteed for 99 years. And although Joe Biden had been one round who thought this was a good and progressive thing to do, and he was in support of it, since Trump has made his choices, and Marco Rubio, being his likely Secretary of State, has absolutely gone for this deal in public, saying it's very, very bad for American security interests, it's terrible, and the incoming President-elect Trump will not support it. Now, David Lammy and Keir Starmer could have coped with that. But we've also got the newly elected Prime Minister of Mauritius saying that his predecessor, who did the deal, was guilty of high treason. He doesn't support the deal either, which makes it very, very hard for Jonathan Powell, now the National Security Advisor, to actually keep this deal on track. I think you turning on it, which now it seems to me quite likely, would be an absolute national humiliation.
Rachel, I mean, Andrew's saying Labour have got a couple of years. At what point do politicians in a parliament start looking at the polls and get really worried?
Well, we answered a sort of flip side question last week, which was when are we going to start to see results from Labour's policy? And we kind of went through some of the spending plans, some of the new legislation and when it's going to come in. I would say 2 years out from an election, you start to look at the timeline. And you've also got to look at how many budgets and autumn statements you've got, because governments like to put a sweetener in the budget in terms of often a tax cut just before the election. They all do it. Then there are things like the new houses that Labour says it's going to build over the course of the Parliament. They haven't got year-by-year targets. They've got a Parliament target. So that's going to be a massive factor. The new NHS appointment appointments. We've talked before how probably the next election is going to be fought, unless there's a big national security issue, the next election is going to be fought on, can you get a GP appointment, where a waiting list, does the NHS feel like it's in a less broken state than it is now, which is why Wes Streeting is probably the most important minister out and about at the moment.
The biggest, you were talking a moment ago, Hannah, about self-created trouble, and in a sense you can say Chagos was like that. But the biggest thing, of course, is the budget itself, and I think we're still living in the aftershock of the budget period, and the question as to whether British industry, British business, because of the national insurance increases, is really going to stop hiring, really going to stop investing, and that therefore the hopes of this being a growth government are stymied right at the beginning is the single biggest question. We don't know the answer to that. It's possible that the Rachel Reeves plan for sort of reforming the planning system, deregulating and encouraging business with the thought that this is now going to be an absolutely stable, unchanging regime for 4.5 years, will actually overwhelm the protests we've had at the moment. But if they can't get growth, then everything gets much, much worse. So I think that is the single biggest problem that they're looking at. And I don't think we'll know the answer to that for probably about a year. But everybody who knows anything in government is going to be looking at those numbers, looking at what's actually happening to investment, what's actually happening to employment and growth as the key, potentially self-made problem.
So they're worrying already, and you're both suggesting that there could be now years of unpopular but necessary decisions.
Yes.
I think the first 2 years is where the unpopular stuff will be front-loaded.
But they have no choice, do they, other than to make these difficult decisions? Because, they want to be a two-term government, if not more. You have to build the...
You have to build the foundations, as Xi Jinping so helpfully put it the other day. But at the same time, I don't think they had thought through properly, for instance, what's going to happen in Ukraine. They had not thought through properly that they are going to have to put, I'm told they are going to put a date on getting to 2.5% for defence quite soon. That is going to be very, very hard. Rachel Reeves doesn't have the money for that now. She's going to have to find it from somewhere.
I think the position and the challenges facing the Labour government are all the same as the ones facing the Conservatives. And if the Conservatives, if there had been easy answers, then the Conservatives would have found them. The one thing that Labour has, which the Conservatives didn't, is time, which means you're going to see a front-loading of the unpopular decisions and a hope that they will feed through into benefits that people can really feel by the time of the next election. They are worrying now, as Andrew said, like they've been worrying since the beginning. Morgan McSweeney has a 2029 plan already that he's trying to lay the groundwork for. They are helped, I think, by the fact that the Conservative Party is still in disarray. Kemi Badenoch won the leadership contest without any policy platform. She explicitly said she didn't have a policy platform. She wanted to kind of do a period of thinking and reflection. And I think the Conservative Party needs that. I also think that has been damaging to her in her first weeks as leader, because the one piece of ammunition that Keir Starmer and Labour have against anything she says is, well, what would you do differently? And she has made some errors in the sense that she has criticised bits of the budget but says that she would like the public spending. That doesn't make the Conservative Party look serious. She said that she, opposes the national insurance increases for employers, but she's not sure if she would reverse it or not. Let's have a review. That does not suggest a party in government. Obviously, the Conservatives have time to try and regroup and decide what it is that they stand for. But until there looks like they're a credible opposition, Labour have a slightly easier time of it.
I think that's right. And we're in a very, very strange position that I can't recall ever happening before, which is that we have a very unpopular government at the moment and a pretty unpopular opposition too. In other words, the entire conventional, familiar British political landscape is unpopular, which of course is exactly why Nigel Farage and Richard Tice are looking so happy. We may well be in for a period where the next election is a bigger shock than the last one. And, I was talking to a Labour minister this week who said, really what we need next is for the Conservatives to revive. We need Kemi Badenoch to do a bit better. We need the Conservatives to do better because we know what the alternative is.